Now let's look at the problem of solving linear inequalities. So, first of all, there's one key rule to solving linear inequalities, and that is solving linear inequalities is exactly like solving linear equations except for one thing, and that is what's known as except for the sign flipping rule. And the sign flipping rule simply states that when you multiply or divide by a negative, the sign flips. And the key, let's be a little more specific here, when you divide or multiply both sides. So we're not talking about distributing, we're talking about distributing both sides with the negative. Then the sign flips. And what we mean by flips is that if it's facing in this direction, it flips to that direction. Whether it's greater than or equal or less than or equal. So let's do an example. So if the first example is pretty straightforward, 3x plus 6 greater than or equal to 18. So what we're going to do is we're going to treat this exactly like an equation unless we divide or multiply both sides by a negative. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract 6 from both sides. I get 3x greater than or equal to 12. Does the sign flip? No, it doesn't. I didn't multiply or divide by a negative. Now I'm going to divide by 3 and I get x is greater than or equal to 4. Does the sign flip? I divided, but I didn't divide by a negative, so then I'm done. Nothing complicated about it unless you have the sign flipping rule. Let's do one more example. 12x plus 6 less than or equal to 8x plus 34. Now here you can put the x on either side, though it's more traditional to put it here on the left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract 8x and subtract 8x, and I get 4x plus 6 less than or equal to 34. And then I'm going to subtract 6 and subtract 6, and I get 4x is less than or equal to, I think that's 28. Then I'm going to divide both sides by 4, and I get x is less than or equal to 7, right? Divide by 4, divide by 4. The sign doesn't flip. The reason the sign doesn't flip is I didn't multiply or divide both sides by negatives. Let's look at the case where it does flip. So you have 5 minus 3x less than or equal to 4x plus 1. What I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract 4x from both sides, and I get 5 minus 7x is less than or equal to 1. Now I'm going to subtract 5, and I get negative 7x less than or equal to minus 4. Now I'm going to divide this side by a negative 7 and this side by a negative 7. And when I divide both sides by a negative, the sign flips. So since it was pointing to the left, now it's going to point to the right. This now becomes positive, and yet x is greater than or equal to minus 4/7. That's an example of the sign flipping rule. Let's look at an example. This problem actually causes students some trouble, so be careful here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to distribute this negative 2. That becomes minus 6x minus 12 plus 1. Now let's think about whether or not the sign flips. I did multiply by a negative, but I didn't multiply both sides by a negative. So I'm just distributing. So in that case, the sign does not flip. 4x plus 9 combine like terms, I get minus 6x minus 11 greater than or equal to 4x plus 9. Now I have x's on both sides. It doesn't matter which side I put it on. More traditionally, it's put on the left-hand side. It just makes more sense, so it'd be good form to always do that. I'm going to subtract 4x from both sides. Minus 10x minus 11, 9. Now think about whether the sign flips here. I subtracted from both sides, but that's not the rule. The rule is, remember, the sign flipping rule is when you divide or multiply both sides with a negative, then the sign flips. So this here, the sign does not flip. I'm going to add 11 to both sides, and I get minus 10x greater than or equal to 20. Now I'm going to divide by a negative 10, and I'm going to divide by a minus 10. X, 20 over minus 10, and negative 10 is a minus 2. Now let's think about whether the sign flips here. I divide both sides by a negative, so it does. So there's my final answer right there. Now a couple of things to be careful of is when you're looking at greater than or equal signs, less than or equal signs, remember it always points to the smaller number or smaller side. Now if you need help with graphing these, sometimes I'll ask you to graph these. If we want to graph this, then we would graph a number line. This would be minus 2. It's either going to be an open or closed dot. In this case, it's going to be a closed dot at negative 2. And I'm going to shade to the left. Now, if you need help with the shading, then there's another video. It's simply called Shading Linear Inequalities. Anyway, that's how you solve for linear inequalities.